Ladies and gentlemen, Jimmy at the Crossroads will be live in moments with engaging and intelligent talk, Sang style. Stay tuned.
It's off, right? Okay.
And that, my friends, is how America was made great once again. Breaking at this hour, Jimmy Sengenberger is currently at the crossroads of politics and economics. Radio broadcaster master, now the celeb on the web. He's the smarty of the party. He's in cahoots with the grassroots. Jimmy at the Crossroads brings you thought-provoking commentary, hard-hitting interviews, original satire, and the best bumper music known to man. Jimmy at the Crossroads!
Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix, I said. Gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. People want answers, they want to understand. They come to the crossroads and Jimmy gives them the plan. I said, gonna talk money, gonna talk politics, great for all generations. Oh, what a great mix. I got Jimmy at the crossroads, making sense out of nonsense. Come on, Jimmy, what you got?
Hello, my friends, and welcome once again to Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, your host for the program, and it is a pleasure and a privilege to be with you today, as it is now just about every day of the week, with engaging, intelligent talk, sang style, making sense out of nonsense, where politics and economics collide. So great to be with you and to try to make heads or tails out of all the craziness that seems to be ensuing across the country right now. If this is your first edition of Jimmy at the Crossroads, welcome. We're a newer program in partnership with the Washington Examiner, which I'm so pleased to have on board. They have great reporting, great commentary. I've been working with them for years as a radio host on Denver Talk Radio, and now very excited to be partnered up with them. Today, we're going to do two main things in a shorter edition of the program. First, we're going to talk a little bit about what happened last night in the debate between Biden and Bernie. We're going to call them that, Biden and Bernie, so that way we can keep the bees going. But Biden versus Bernie, as Nathan Matoush, my yeoman producer, puts it, it was duel of two fates. Kind of use a Star Wars reference, the duel of two fates. And I think that really did play out. We will break that down as well as some of the coronavirus COVID-19 politics with syndicated columnist Ruben Navarrette here in just a moment. Then we will have a little break and come back with some thoughts from yours truly on what the Federal Reserve did over the weekend and this topsy-turvy stock market that just seems to never be giving anybody any peace of mind. But first, let's go, without further ado, to our guest for this edition of the program here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. For the first time here, but definitely not the first time I have interviewed him, Ruben Navarrette is a syndicated columnist joining us from California, and I'm so pleased to welcome him to the show. Ruben, happy Monday to you, and welcome. Nope. We are not hearing Ruben's volume for a moment, and I'm getting an echo right now, Matoush. Okay, Ruben, go ahead and try talking again.
Okay, so good to be with you, Jimmy, on your new show. Looks great.
Hey, thank you. I appreciate it. And by the way, Ruben, what'd you make of that opening?
It was great. You're making sense out of nonsense is perfect for you. The years I've known you, the show I've been on, this is a good format for you, and it makes politics and current events fun and accessible to more people, which is great.
Well, I appreciate it. That's exactly what we're going to be trying to do. I mean, you were on my old morning show Business for Breakfast as a regular weekday guest, including Mondays, actually, coincidentally, on a regular basis. And I have to say that it's always great to get your insights as well, because you come in with, when necessary, a positive attitude, other times a serious tone. And I never know where you're going to come at the issues from day to day, because you're all over the place sometimes. I'm just curious, before we get into the debate, some of the politics of what's going on, how do you approach the news of the day as someone who's been syndicated columnist for, 25 years now? More than that?
Yeah, so I've been writing for newspapers for 30 years, and I've been syndicated with the Washington Post for 20. And I'll tell you this, what I try to do in all cases is, if you're writing about a topic that's pretty well plowed over because lots of other people are talking about it, the challenge this week might be to write about the coronavirus in a way that's different and unique. You've got to really think through the topic first, come at it from a completely different angle. I'm not married to either political party. I'm not a partisan. I do not like Democrats or Republicans. And I bring a certain fairness and clear-eyed analysis to my work that has paid off for me. It's made it very difficult, Jimmy, for me to be on television over the years, because on TV, on CNN and elsewhere, they want somebody from the right and the left dependably. But that same unpredictability has served me well in newspapers and through my column, because you're right. Readers, they come away and say, I don't always agree with you, but you make me think, and I appreciate that.
Yeah, no, that is certainly important. I agree with you. The thinking, but you can make somebody think as well if you are more ideologically minded. I mean, I make no bones about it. I consider myself a constitutional conservative, a limited government kind of guy. But I want to make sure that what I'm talking about and saying and what my guests are providing is thoughtful content that gets people thinking. And that's what's so important about all of this. And I think, Ruben, just as a quick commentary on today's media, that's lacking in most circles.
It's absolutely lacking. I'd say that it's very difficult if you're a hardcore partisan, to either think through your position or encourage others to think. If you are a liberal Democrat and you believe that the only problem with public schools is that we're not spending enough money on them, I don't believe that. But if you believe that, you've already shut off part of your brain to the idea that there may be some value in charter schools or vouchers or private schools and the like. And so that's what I find with many of my partisan friends on the right and the left. They're very smart people. But they're not using their whole brain because they've cut off part of it to suit their politics. There are certain things that my Democrat friends will not entertain and think of and consider, and there are some things that my Republican friends will not think about and entertain, and that's unfortunate.
Yeah, for sure. All right, Ruben Navarrette, syndicated columnist. Let's jump right into last night's debate. It was the first time, and I think probably the last time, that we will see Joe Biden, former vice president of the United States, and Bernie Sanders together in a debate format. It was something, especially because there were only two people on stage with no audience to speak of. Let's play a little snippet here that Nathan Matoush has queued up to kind of help set the stage for us. Let's go ahead and do cut 2, because this just is an interesting example of the two of them together in terms of one trying to call out the other, and you see how Biden handled it, and then we'll jump into the debate talk. Go ahead.
Okay. It's good that you had an idea 30 years ago. I don't want to join you. Why don't you join me? Why don't you get rid of the super PAC that you have right now, which is running very ugly negative ads about me, by the way. Don't laugh, Joe. That's just the truth. And they got 2 other super PACs running ads against us. Why don't you just say right now, go on television and say, hey, you know what? I think in the past, Joe, if I'm not mistaken, you condemned super PACs. Is that correct?
You get rid of the 9 super PACs you have?
I don't have 9 super. I don't have any
have
super
9.
PACs.
You want me to list them?
No. Yeah, you go ahead. List them.
Okay, come on. Give me a break.
No, I won't give you a break on this one, Joe. You condemned super PACs. You got a super PAC is running negative. But here's the point. This is the point. In the richest country in the history of the world, half of our people should not be struggling to put food on the table. And the reason for that is you have a political structure in which big money interests not only dominate the political system, but dominate our economy as well. Somebody makes a decision, we're going to shut down a factory in America, we're going to move to China, we're going to move to Mexico, pay people starvation wages there.
All right, Ruben Navarrette, that was just a clip to kind of set the tone. That was one of the interesting moments that caught my attention, but what'd you make of last night, my friend?
Well, this was riveting stuff. I've not seen stuff like this since the Lincoln Douglas debate, and it's our good fortune that both of these men were, in fact, present.
Wait, were you around during Lincoln Douglas?
No, but these 2 were.
That's true.
That's the important part. They were in the audience, and now they're on stage. It was something to see, Jimmy, to see the 78-year-old and the 77-year-old dueling over their various records going back many years, going back 30, 40 years in some cases. There were tense moments in the middle where they talked about Social Security and whether you would ever support cutting it and the like, and going back over their records. I was struck by, I've never seen a debate like this before, because not just because there was no audience, and without an audience, it's hard to tell who won. I didn't miss the audience until it wasn't there. I'd always taken these debate audiences for granted. But as long as there's no applause and no oohing and eyeing, there's no reaction from the audience, it's very difficult to see who's winning. And that was a challenge. Lastly, the last thing I think that struck me is that Bernie Sanders really hits hard. He punches hard. And I'm struck by the fact that he can't win this race. The numbers aren't there. The math isn't there. There's no way he's going to win this race. He's all but out of it, but he still punches hard. What is he trying to accomplish at this point, if not to simply bloody up the eventual nominee? So I'm all for, a good fight, but at this point in the game, I'm not sure what Bernie was trying to accomplish.
Ruben Navarrette, again, our guest, syndicated columnist here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. One thing on the audience, I actually found it kind of refreshing because you didn't have the hoots and hollers and all that distracting you. You could see how these guys really sort of squared up against one another and talking about the issues. I'm curious. I doubt it will be a permanent thing, but I'd be very curious if there's talk in the future about actually not having audiences, coronavirus or not.
Right. What's interesting is, and I'm a bit older than you, more than a bit older than you, but I certainly grew up with lots of sitcoms growing up. Watching lots of sitcoms growing up, I became very accustomed to the laugh track. And you'd have a laugh track with various, sitcoms, and it became wired into my brain so that now when I watch a show that's taped live without an audience and there's no laugh track, for instance, I'm kind of waiting to see what the funny lines are. So I need some prodding from the audience in that regard. It's the way my brain is wired in terms of watching all those commercials and seeing all those sitcoms over the years. And I think that there is a role to be played by the audience. And I was missing it last night. It was difficult at times to see which punches were landing and which ones weren't. There was a moment where Bernie Sanders incorrectly identified the coronavirus as the Ebola virus. Yeah. 2 or 3 times. In fact, he had to correct himself.
We have that cut here. We can play it in just one moment. But I do want to make one observation that's interesting in my mind about the audience. Sure. I watched Jimmy Fallon's opening monologue from his show on Friday. He didn't have an audience. But he did have some people from the crew who were at least out there so that he could have a little bit of audience reaction of some sort. What's a little surprising to me, not necessarily surprising, but what I wouldn't have been surprised for CNN to do would have been to have a small audience of like 20 people. Sometimes they've done that as sort of a focus group type of thing for this debate, so you'd at least get a little bit of audience reaction.
Because in short of that, in absence of that, it does feel a bit sterile. It feels a little more programmed, and it's hard to see the inflections and exactly where they're getting their momentum. If it threw me off as a viewer, I'm sure it threw off the debaters. But I was just struck by the fact that even, for instance, in the clip you're about to play, where Bernie mentions Ebola, had there been an audience, there may have been snickers, or there may have been people saying, he got that wrong. But there was just something missing. I missed the audience more than I thought I would. But in terms of the combatants going at it, it's clear, Jimmy, these two people do not like each other. That was clear. They are intent on beating each other up over their records. They all have sort of slippery explanations for why they voted the way they did 40 years ago on a given issue. But they're not laying the other person off the hook for their past votes. It's a very interesting debate to watch.
So let's play cut one here, which actually includes both Biden and Bernie flubs on what this virus is named or what it's going by, COVID-19, coronavirus, whatever. We got a few clips put together in a montage. Take a look at this.
We can do that. We did that. We've been through this before with the coronavirus. We've been through this before. We've been through this before with dealing with the viruses that the N1H15, as well as what happened in Africa. For example, he came along and said, "I got a great idea. You're going to tell
Senator
me."
Sanders.
The Ebola crisis, in my view, exposes the dysfunctionality of our healthcare system.
No one is in a position where they have a significant financial disability as a consequence of this SARS, of this particular crisis.
Now, technically, Joe Biden's right. The full name of this, I believe, includes SARS in there. But what did you make of the fact that both of them had these mental lapses in that moment, which really goes to the question about their age and the notion of are they going to be there if they become president of the United States? And also how they would square up, especially Biden, who's the likely nominee, against Donald Trump in a debate.
Yeah, it's a very good point, Jimmy. I mean, Joe Biden has gotten the rap, obviously, of not being strong. His cognitive skills are not strong, and that's certainly what they were and used to be. He was sharper in this debate and the previous debates. He's gotten sharper at the end of the campaign than he was at the beginning of the campaign. That's for sure. Bernie Sanders has been pretty much sharp, coherent. He's got good cognitive skills until last night. And I think he made a couple of errors there. It's got to reinforce the notion that being up to the job is not just being able to do push-ups, not just being able to travel around the country. These people have incredible travel skills, travel schedules. They work hard on the road. I get that. But it's more than that. It's do you have the mental ability, acumen to get you where you need to go to be president and to do this incredibly difficult job. And that was something to see. You had these two older white men who were 78 and 77 years old, and ultimately not a whole lot of difference in their public record and their voting record over time, though they would disagree with that. And I guess the party was looking at itself thinking, is this what we have? This is where all that diversity ended up bringing us.
Yeah, isn't that fascinating how we ended up with people who are actually in a generation older than President Trump. President Trump is one of the first baby boomers. They're among the last of what's called the silent generation. It's so fascinating in the context of talking about millennials and even the rising Generation Z. And of course, you guys in Gen X that are squeezed in there somewhere. It's just so fascinating that we're talking boomers versus silence.
Right. No, absolutely. And the silent generation is interesting because it's the only generation in American history to not produce a president. This may continue if neither one of the two gentlemen we saw in this debate becomes president. You went from the World War II generation, skipped over to boomers, and now you'll deal with the generations after that. But the silent generation does have some characteristics, and they tend to be very practical in the way they attack problems, very much like Joe Biden. Bernie Sanders, I will say this about him: he has this very interesting ability to communicate. He speaks in these this cadence, this choppy cadence that's very clear and breaking down things. A lot of what he says is spin. It's nonsense. Some of it's dishonest. There are lies. He's not telling the truth on immigration, for instance, and his record there. But he does it so clearly. He's able to communicate, and it has served him well, I think, because for people who get tired of political doublespeak, he simply breaks it down in a way that you can understand it.
That is an important value when it comes to debating, especially on the national stage like that. Ruben Navarrette, our guest syndicated columnist, at Ruben Navarrette on Twitter, by the way. It doesn't say that on the screen, but want to let you know. Cut 4 here is an interesting instance where Joe Biden gets called out by Bernie Sanders over the issue of Social Security cuts, which, especially in the context of a Democratic primary, I found to be an important moment. Let's take a look at this.
I am saying that you have been on the floor of the Senate time and time again talking about the need to cut Social Security, Medicare, and veterans programs. Is that true, or is that
no,
not
it's
true?
not true.
That is not true?
That is not true. What is true is, in terms of the negotiations that are taking place, how to deal with the deficit, everything was on the table. I did not support any of those cuts in Social Security or in veterans benefits.
Whoa. Everything was on the table. All right, you're right. You just said it, including, in your judgment, cuts to Social Security and veterans.
In order to get the kinds of changes we need on other things related.
Joe, then
but we did not cut it.
I know, because people like me helped stop that. But Joe, you just contradicted yourself. One minute you said I was not on the floor. The next minute you say, well, yes, there was a reason why I was worried about the deficit. Maybe that's good reason, maybe it's not. All that I am saying is you were prepared to cut and advocated for the cuts of programs.
I did not. I never voted to cut Social Security.
Not talking about voted, Joe. That's not what.
All right, let's stop it right there. And then I do want to play, before we get your reaction to that exchange, Ruben Navarrette. This is cut 5, which is an ad Bernie Sanders has been running about Social Security, which is what both of them sort of referenced there.
When I argued that we should freeze federal spending, I meant Social Security as well. I meant Medicare and Medicaid. I meant veterans benefits. I meant every single solitary thing in the government. And I not only tried it once, I tried it twice, I tried it a third time, and I tried it a fourth time.
Well, we've got some bad news for them. We are not going to cut Social Security. We're going to expand benefits. I'm Bernie Sanders, and I approve this message.
So that's the ad that Bernie's been running on Social Security. And one important clarification there, Biden did talk in that clip about freezing the spending, which is not the same thing as cutting. But what did you make, A, of that exchange, which was particularly interesting, and B, of the substance?
So the exchange, Jimmy, was an unfair rhetorical mugging by Bernie Sanders. It was cheap politics. He says initially Joe voted to cut Social Security. When Biden protests, 45 seconds later, Bernie comes back and says, this is not about voting. Nobody's talking about voting. It was Bernie who mentioned voting in his very first sentence in salvo. What Joe Biden said was everything was on the table as we talked about reducing the deficit, the debt, and everything was on the table. At that point, Sanders comes in and says, aha, you contradicted yourself. Everything was on the table. Joe Biden's simple response at that point was, yes, Bernie, but I wasn't the one who set the table. Okay? The table was already set. It was a discussion about what we should do with regard to social spending to cut the debt. I looked at all the things and all the things on the table, and I chose not to support any cuts to Social Security. But as you listen carefully, and I did to that segment, you can see the dishonesty of Bernie Sanders trying to take Biden's record and his words and twist them to suit him. But that's unfortunate. But it shows something about Bernie Sanders. He's not an honest politician. He tries to be all things to all people. Ironically, Jimmy, the mainstream media will tell you that Bernie Sanders is as authentic as they come. He's the real thing. What you see is what you get. But when you dig a little deeper on a lot of these issues, you see that he tries to have it both ways, on guns, on immigration, on spending, on Social Security reform. He tries to have it both ways, and it's not fair. And so somebody ought to call him on it. Unfortunately, I think Biden got defensive and he got flustered. And he wasn't able to put Bernie in his place.
Ruben Navarrette, one final question on this presidential race, and then a couple quick hits on the COVID-19 coronavirus crisis right now. Where do you think this election heads? Is it Biden's in the bag now, the nomination? I mean, my view is it is. I think that Biden just needed to do fine last night. It was a low bar for him. It was do fine. He did fine, and I think that was the test he needed to pass, and now it's going to be inevitable for him. I don't think it certainly changes anything in favor of Bernie Sanders, especially as we go into tomorrow's multiple state primary. What do you think is next in this primary? Do you agree with what I said?
I agree with what you said. This was Joe Biden's race. It has been his race as of South Carolina. When South Carolina voted, it basically sent a message that African Americans would go for Biden, and that Bernie Sanders and nobody can become the Democratic nominee if they don't have strong support from African Americans. It would be like trying to become the Republican nominee without having strong support from white evangelicals. You couldn't do it. And likewise here, Bernie Sanders is never going to make peace with African Americans. They're never going to come around to him. And South Carolina led to big victories on Super Tuesday in the South. 3 or 4 states in the South, and then the Michigan primary, which is incredibly important. These were all big wins for Biden. The numbers are clear. The math is clear. Bernie Sanders can't win. And so it's going to be Biden versus Donald Trump. Now, here's what happened, Jimmy. A month ago, you would have said this was Trump's in the bag. He can beat Biden. He's going to be much stronger than Biden. He has a great economy. But thanks to the virus and thanks to the virus threat, now you have this other unpredictable element that we can talk about now, but clearly that has thrown the race, I think, into flux. Nobody knows how this will end.
Ruben Navarrette is syndicated columnist, our guest here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. And let's shift gears here to the coronavirus situation. Cut 6 to set some context. This is a snippet yesterday of the press conference that was led by Vice President Mike Pence, and specifically talking about coronavirus testing.
With regard to testing, as we expand testing, we're so pleased that Congress joined with our administration to make sure that cost is never going to be a barrier to anyone getting a coronavirus test. As you recall, several weeks ago, the President directed a change in our Medicare and Medicaid programs to ensure that coronavirus testing was included. Health insurers were brought in. They all agreed to waive copays, but because of the good bipartisan work done in the House of Representatives, now all coronavirus testing is free, and it's free for every American, including uninsured Americans. And we continue to urge passage of the legislation that will be considered by the Senate this week.
Couple questions, Ruben Navarrette. The first one is this. What do you make so far of how the coronavirus response has transpired and developed over the course, particularly of the past week? And where do you see this crisis as being at right now from the economic standpoint and from the health standpoint?
Yeah, so the administration has failed the coronavirus test, right? It is, the Democrats can be glib about this. They've been calling it this administration's Katrina and the like. That only cheapens the discussion. But on any level, the media on the left and the administration on the right made the same mistake. They went from ignoring the virus threat to 7 weeks later coming back full blast, going 0 to 60. And now they're in crisis mode. That is not a good look. What Mike Pence is not telling us here is that while he is making a statement that tests will be free, he's not telling you that there'll be enough tests available. He's not telling you that if you feel you have XYZ symptoms, you can go to the hospital, and the hospital won't be ultimately the determinant as to whether or not you get a test. So politicians are always caught in a rough spot, be they Republican or Democrat. And that is, they can't have a panic. They've got to try to reassure us they're in charge. But when you look carefully at what they're promising and what they're saying, it's very clear to figure out what they're not promising, what they're not saying, what they can't guarantee in the real world. And to your point about the economics of it, it says something that the Fed cuts its interest rates to 0. It says something that people are concerned about going to grocery stores, that restaurants and bars in California are being closed. Restaurants, at least, they're limited, restricted to a certain number of people. In states like Ohio and Illinois, closed outright restaurants. Bars and pubs being closed in California. This is a huge problem. There's a huge amount of fear. There's so much we don't know. There's 100 different things we could talk about that we don't know right now still. And people are concerned. The kids are home from school. They're concerned about being a carrier to elderly and visiting your grandparents or your parents. And there being a threat there. People who have pre-existing conditions, who are suffering from cancer treatment and the like. Anyway, it's a disaster. It's not. We've gone from not caring about this and treating it lightly. What kind of nonsense, Jimmy, did we hear from this administration in the last few weeks? I heard President Trump, who's an idiot, I think he's demonstrated it clearly here, that this would be gone by summer because when it gets hot, well, it goes away. He also said if you ignore it, it goes away. He also said not to panic, go to the mall, shop, spend money. This is not not George W. Bush after 9/11.
Ruben, I would look at this as a pox on both houses, actually. And I say this as somebody who's broadly supportive of President Trump. I don't think that he set the tone right early on. I think it was better when he gave his speech last Wednesday. There were imperfections in the speech for sure, but I think that at least it hit the right tone, which was the most important thing in my view at that point. I think the messaging's gotten a little bit better, but still has a ways to go, and I hope they get that sorted out in addition to making sure that people are getting the tests. But he didn't call that a hoax. What he called a hoax, Ruben, was the way in which Democrats were responding to it at that point in time, especially when you put in the context of the other political dynamics with the impeachment. But in terms of hoax, he shouldn't have used that language. Like, absolutely, even in the context of a political hoax, he should not have used that hoax in the context of a viral now pandemic. But the Democrats also have not handled this well because all they've been trying to do is scaremonger from the beginning in ways that are geared more towards hurting President Trump than actually trying to level with the American people and saying, well, here's the reality. The one guy, Ruben, who I think has done a great job at bringing the reality to the American people is Dr. Anthony Fauci. That's the guy that we should be looking to for input. But go ahead.
Well, I agree with you. Let's understand that, I'm the king of pox on both houses. I get that. I've been doing that for 40 years. I like doing that. I would not say that Chuck Schumer and Nancy Pelosi and others and Democrats have done well either, and they have politicized this. But here's the major difference, and I learned this last night during the debate watching Sanders and Biden. Sanders has almost zero executive experience. If you don't go all the way back to when he was a mayor of a small town in Vermont, he has been in the Senate and in the House of Representatives before that. And so he would make various comments during the debate, Jimmy, where he said, we talked about this and I talked about this, and it's important to talk about unpopular subjects. That's all Bernie Sanders does is talk because he's in the legislative branch. Joe Biden has been in the executive branch, okay? So in a crisis like this, the executive branch is more important than the legislative branch. It doesn't matter that Congress is playing politics with this. It's the executive branch that has to carry out the laws and protect people and reassure people, not the Democrats. So the Democrats in Congress are worthless. I agree. We stipulate. No problem. I'm not going to argue with that. But that doesn't impact what's happening on the executive branch, where the power is and where the responsibility lies.
Fair enough, Ruben. I think that is a valuable point, but that's why I'm looking to guys like Anthony Fauci, who is part of the Trump administration. He's the guy that they're appointed to be the biggest advocate for the policy that he's putting forward, and also being the guy who's speaking out most fluently on this issue, testifying, going on the Sunday shows. That's smart. He should be the guy just spearheading this. He's been there since '84, Ruben. Go ahead.
2 weeks ago, Donald Trump and Fauci disagreed as of 2 weeks ago. There was daylight between them. One was trying to calm everybody down. It's a hoax. It's not going to matter. Go to the mall. And the other was saying, we don't know the end of this. This is just the beginning. There's too many, be much more careful. Now, I will say this. The president has moved toward Fauci. Instead of Fauci moving toward the president, that I'm glad
Which is good. Absolutely.
That's great. That's the best part of this.
I agree with you. Well, Ruben Navarrette, syndicated columnist, thanks for taking extra time. Went a little longer here today, and I really appreciate it. It's always so great to talk with you. Syndicated columnist, tell us where people can find you.
At RubenNavarrette.com, at my website. You can Google me. I'm in over 100 newspapers with the Washington Post Writers Group. You can follow my podcast, Navarrette the Nation, and follow me on Twitter as well.
It's not Navarrette?
Navarrette is, yeah. It's Navarrette.
I just hear like Bill O'Reilly. Bill O'Reilly and others have called you like Ruben Navarrette I've seen before. And I'm like, no, it's Navarrette.
Yeah. That's how I heard it all my life through public school. So I'm used to both.
All right, my friend. You're always an interesting thinker, and it's great to have you on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
All right, once again, Ruben Navarrette, syndicated columnist, joining us here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Always fascinating insights from Ruben, and he will be on here regularly, I am sure of that. All right, you are, once again, watching Jimmy at the Crossroads, making sense of nonsense in partnership with the Washington Examiner. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger, bringing you engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit about the economics and markets dynamics that we're seeing play out, especially with what's going on with the Federal Reserve. Keep it right here.
Scene. We're coming in. Oh, g'day, mate. You know, after a long day of kangaroo wrangling and croc roping, a man can really work up an appetite. Not to mention a whopper of a backache. I know a place, and that's why I like coming into the Back Out Steakhouse. The Back Out is the only place I know where you can sit down in a lumbar support Barca lounger and enjoy a big juicy bandicoot steak or a thick koala chop served by a licensed chiropractor. And as you partake of your meal, your server will provide you with a spinal manipulation, neck twist, the hip alignment, the full Matilda. One visit to the Back Out Steakhouse and your spirits will return like an Abbo's boomerang. So the next time your back goes on walkabout and you're coincidentally, simultaneously craving a slab of cooked meat, waltz on into the Back Out Steakhouse. You not only feel good down under, but all over. Back Out Steakhouse! Good stuff, eh, Skippy? Bloody boomerangs. Back Out Steakhouse!
America's politics are crazy. The culture is in flux. That's why we work hard to help you keep up.
More politics, more culture, and more access.
We focus on the biggest stories of the day with some of the biggest names in politics and punditry.
Go to our website, WashingtonExaminer.com. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Be sure to follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Hello, Jimmy. This is President Ronald Reagan, calling from the great beyond on your hotline. It's a different number than the one I used to contact Mr. Gorbachev, but it's no less important, especially at this kind of time. Well, Nancy and I, we stay on the ranch now here in heaven, and we're your biggest fans. We sit out on the porch there, and I'll have my Nancy, bless her heart, she makes me some tea, and we listen to your show, every minute of it. We fully support you in what you're about to accomplish in the future. Nothing but peaceful progress. Some people say, well, what will Jimmy do now? Well, stand by, because you're going to see some real fireworks. This young man has so many great ideas, and so forth. Why, I hate to interrupt, Ronnie, but let me just say this about that. I couldn't agree more with the way that you and Nancy feel about this entire thing. Jackie and I have been observing and listening to the Sengenberger show, and with regards to that, he's on the edge of a new frontier. No looking back, and I declare that by the time this decade is out, he'll have a syndicated show that will spread all the way across the universe. Oh, well, Jimmy, that was Jack Kennedy. He likes to get every word in edgewise. I tease him a lot. He likes to go out on my boat there and tool around on the sailboat. Well, Nancy brings him lemonade. He enjoys it. Yes, we're both, all of us are big fans. Oh, well, Jimmy, it seems that Nancy's ringing that old chuck wagon dinner bell, and it's time to go get all the fixins'. Coming, Mother. So, we'd just like to say congratulations. Well done. In closing, I'd like to say
that if you ever run into an obstacle that seems too big or too daunting, well, I'll say this. Mr. Sengenberger, tear down that wall.
Welcome back to Jimmy at the Crossroads. I'm Jimmy Sengenberger. Great to be with you today. Thanks for joining us on this Monday. We're going to talk a little bit about the markets on this Monday. Things are going pretty crazy right now, it seems, with the way markets are responding. As of this broadcast, we're down about 2,000 points. I expect we may close that much on the Dow, meaning that we are about 21,000. 21,000 in the Dow, losing another 8% on the Dow, nearly 8% on the S&P, as well as the NASDAQ. Tomorrow we will be joined by Mark D. Cook.
For our policy interest rate
tomorrow we're going to be introduced to Mark D. Cook on the show, and it's going to be very interesting getting his thoughts on what's happening in terms of the stock market, in terms of investing, in terms of how to prepare now for this bear market that's here. He's the author of the book, Prepare Now and Survive the Coming Bear Market. And now the bear market is actually here. So what do we do? What is an investor to do? And where might this thing be headed? So the Federal Reserve is ramping up its activities, going back into what seems like crisis-era policy from 2008. We're talking here even about the fact that the Fed now is restoring quantitative easing, where they are buying up $500 billion in Treasury bonds, as well as $200 billion in mortgage-backed securities, which was this quantitative easing. He didn't want to label that. Jerome Powell, will play Jerome Powell in just a moment. But he didn't want to call it quantitative easing, but that really, folks, that is exactly what Powell is actually doing here, what the Federal Reserve is doing by buying up those mortgage-backed securities and Treasury bonds. And in my view, quantitative easing didn't work. It didn't do what it was claimed to have done or was intended to do in terms of its economic impact. And in fact, what we're seeing is investors are just even more spooked by what the Fed is doing. Before I go on any further with sort of a summation of what's happening, let's listen to Jerome Powell, Federal Reserve Chairman himself, yesterday during a press conference after a surprise meeting yesterday that I think took place over the phone by all the Fed members, because they were supposed to meet tomorrow and Wednesday. Instead, they met yesterday and decided to cut the federal funds rate down to its lower bound of 0. Take a listen. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell yesterday.
Today, we reduced the target range for our policy interest rate by 1 percentage point, bringing it close to 0. Economic policymakers must do what we can to ease hardship caused by the disruptions to the economy and to support a swift return to normal. The second quarter is probably going to be weak, in fact, in the view of many, output declining, output lower in the second quarter than it was in the first quarter. After that, it's very hard to say how big the effects will be or how long they will last. We expect to maintain the rate at this level until we're confident that the economy has weathered recent events and is on track to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. We think we have plenty of policy space left, plenty of power left in our tools. We do not see negative policy rates as likely to be an appropriate policy response here in the United States. We're going to be looking at the Treasury market function. Today's FOMC meeting was in lieu of the meeting scheduled for next Tuesday and Wednesday.
So that was a montage that Bloomberg had put together. So I'm going to read a little bit from the Wall Street Journal and their editorial on this, because they summed up today what the Federal Reserve did yesterday and provided some input, because I think they're very much on the money. They said, quote, the best Fed decisions in this regard are his expanded liquidity provisions. And by the way, that's what this is all about, is expanding liquidity. That is to say, the speed with which assets can be turned into cash, because that's the problem. Right now, as we have companies that are facing the economic malaise, they are losing themselves a little bit. That is, they do not have the cash readily available for them to pay their employees or deal with other issues. That's why there's a lot of talk about making sure that there are small business loans that can be provided in larger numbers to small businesses from the federal government, from the Small Business Administration, for example. And that's also what the Fed's trying to do for big companies, for medium companies, to the extent they can, small companies. That's the goal, is to increase liquidity, because people may have assets, companies may have assets, but the question is, are they able to pay employees and do things with that money? Which means you need to quickly turn assets into cash, and that's the biggest thing here. Also being able to access credit so you can get a loan and take that out. So that's what the Fed's trying to do. So let's keep that in mind. And by the way, tomorrow we will have on John Tamny, editor of Real Clear Markets, director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks, who's got a fascinating perspective on the Federal Reserve that has really influenced me in the past couple years of conversations I've had with him, because he's not big believer in the role that the Fed plays, and thinks, as I have come to believe, that the Fed's role is vastly overstated compared with its real impact on the economy. But let's continue reading here from the Wall Street Journal. Here's one of the liquidity efforts that the Fed is embarking on. An enhanced dollar swap facility in coordination with 6 other major central banks around the world. It also reduces the price on the dollar swap rate by 25 basis points to encourage other banks to use the facility, and the rush to the safety of the dollar assets in this time of uncertainty has created a shortage of dollars in some parts of the world, and this will help other central banks fill that financial need. So it's trying to get a flow of dollars out there into the global economy. Remember, the U.S. dollar is a global currency. It is the most expansive currency across the globe today. And so a lot of countries rely upon and use the U.S. dollar, which is why that's valuable. The Fed, the Wall Street Journal continues in their editorial today, also expanded its access to the discount window, which is the classic vehicle for providing liquidity to banks under stress. The Fed made an explicit point of encouraging banks to use the window, no doubt to reduce the stigma that some counterparties attach to banks that use it. The Fed reduced the penalty rate for using the window to 0.25%, which is almost no penalty at all. And I think that's entirely reasonable as well, at least at first blush. Those are some things that do make a little more sense and maybe could have more of an impact on the economy. But when we get to the reduction and the federal funds rate, which is used as a reference point for all sorts of different types of interest rates, mortgage rates, and what have you. Although I don't think the federal funds rate is a controlling rate, it can influence other interest rates. I agree with the Wall Street Journal that it doesn't seem particularly likely to have all that much of an effect, going down to zero. And now, as some are saying, in terms of its at least traditional policy tools, investors know, and this goes to the cornerstone of what's going on in the stock market right now, investors know that the Fed right now, at this point in time, at least using those traditional policy tools, is sort of, as the expression goes, out of ammo right now. They don't have any more bullets in their policy gun. And so that's why markets were spooked, down more than 2,000 points on the Dow today. Because markets, investors are concerned. They are concerned about what is happening when it comes to stocks and bonds, different assets right now. And the Fed underscores the concern because people wonder, is there something we don't know? Is there something else going on here that we don't know that the Fed does about how calamitous this might actually be? But I don't see the reduction down to 0% to 0.25%. That's the range now to the lower bound to cut 1 percentage point, full point, basis point on the federal funds rate. I don't see that as having any sort of real world economic impact. Certainly not something that is going to be really positive. Just instead is more spooking investors at this point in time. The other steps, let me make sure I don't neglect the quantitative easing. As I said before, I don't see that as being a policy that worked from the financial crisis before. And I don't see it as being a policy right now, but the goal is to sort of stabilize the Treasury market. That's what Jerome Powell's looking at, is stabilizing the Treasury markets, because that really is important to our economy. When the stock market's going down, people go and buy Treasury bonds. They want to feel confident in some asset class, and that's what they often go to, is Treasury bonds, because the federal government is at least very good at paying their bills when it's due, their loan bills when it's due. And so if you buy a Treasury bond, the federal government gives you money over a period of time, and that's a reliable sort of investment. In addition to, relatively speaking, to be sure, which is why people continue to do that and why you often see bond yields adjust in tandem with the stock market decline. And that's what we've been seeing. But there's still concern about the stability of the Treasury market. And so that's what Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell is particularly concerned about. But I do not see what's happening right now in terms of the Fed moving forward with the quantitative easing as being a particularly beneficial policy at this point or ever, because I don't see that it worked out in the past. We will discuss this more with John Tamny tomorrow. But here's the bottom line. The Fed is taking some particular steps to try to introduce more liquidity into the system so that the dollars can be floating out there more. People can access dollars, whether here in the United States or across the globe. And also businesses can more quickly turn their assets into cash so they can pay their bills. That's the biggest problem and challenge that we're facing right now that the Fed is zeroing in on. Whether these policies will work, different story. I'm not too confident at this point in time. You certainly need some fiscal policies if you want to have the government involved, really engaged here in order to help businesses make their bills and pay their employees. I mean, right now we're seeing bars and restaurants in states like California and Ohio shut down because of what governor's edicts have been. Here in Colorado, where we're broadcasting from, downhill skiing has been suspended for a week. Now, skiing is a very important part of Colorado's economy, especially in mountain communities. But mountain communities are being the most hit in this particular state by coronavirus. It has the most cases in the counties that are in the mountains that include Vail and Aspen. So there is a legitimate concern, and people are acting in accordance with that concern. But at the same time, I also worry that we are seeing people go overboard a little bit in terms of the markets, in terms of the sell mentality. We had Phil Van Dorn on the program on Thursday, Market Watch investing columnist and analyst, and he pointed out that, look, just going ahead and selling your stocks, especially if you're looking at a long-term horizon, that's not necessarily the best sort of decision to make, because the stock market will recover. If you're a day trader, if you're a very short-term investor, then maybe you might want to make some decisions in that regard. But if you're longer term, remember that the stock market will bounce back. And now might even be an opportunity to be looking for some bargain stocks. Who knows? It really depends. But that's one of the topics we talk about here on Jimmy at the Crossroads. It is where politics and economics collide. And tomorrow, when we come back to the show, we will be joined by John Tamny, again, editor of Real Clear Markets, and the director of the Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks. Get his fascinating and very well-informed perspective on the Fed, and if any of these policies, any of them at all, will really have any sort of an impact positively on the economy, especially when it's so far right now just seems to be spooking investors more. At least that's my first blush reaction to what Federal Reserve Chairman Jerome Powell announced yesterday at that surprise press conference after their surprise decision to cut the federal funds rate down to the lower bound of 0%. and also to restore quantitative easing, so crisis-era policy from the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We will also break down how to survive this bear market with Mark D. Cook, who's a professional stock trader, been doing that kind of work for more than 4 decades. So we've got a lot coming up here on Jimmy at the Crossroads, day in and day out. We're going to call it a day today. Well, we will be back tomorrow for more engaging, intelligent talk, Sang style, as we are making sense of nonsense here again on Jimmy at the Crossroads. Our thanks to Ruben Navarrette for joining us. Nathan Matouche, fantastic producer, doing the Matouche magic here on the show. And also Corby Wise, video production. And you'll see the full credits coming up here. But folks, God bless America during this very difficult time. And always, my thanks as well to the Washington Examiner, our partner. Have a great day.